How did the indigenous peoples of North America survive the harsh winters of the Great Plains or the subarctic forests without modern heating systems? We imagine icy winds piercing through thin tipis and wonder how it was possible to sleep when temperatures dropped to tens of degrees below zero. Intuitively, we look for the answer in a large, roaring fire. But what if fire was not the main salvation from the night cold? What if there was a whole system based not on burning wood, but on the ingenious preservation of the heat that humans already have? This system was invisible, but incredibly effective, built on a deep understanding of materials, physics, and the landscape itself. It included specialized structures, layered clothing, and specific daily habits. This knowledge allowed entire peoples to thrive in conditions that seem impossible for survival today. Watch this video to the end to learn how fur flooring and dome structures allowed people to sleep warmly while blizzards raged outside, and why the inner lining of a teepee was more important than any fire. What if I told you that everything you believed about surviving in the cold isn't entirely true? We tend to think that the best way to stay warm at night in the wilderness is to build a big fire and sleep next to it. This image is firmly embedded in our minds, but for the indigenous peoples of North America, it was often far from reality, especially when it came to sleeping. Sleeping next to an open fire was not so much practical as it was risky and inefficient. A campfire requires constant attention and a huge amount of fuel, which is not always easy to obtain in winter. Left unattended, it could go out, leaving those sleeping in even greater cold, or conversely, flare up and lead to tragedy. In addition, fire warms only one side of the body, while the other, exposed to the cold air, continues to lose heat. This creates constant discomfort and interrupted sleep, as the person has to constantly turn over. The heat from the fire quickly escapes upward, not having time to warm the sleeping area. Smoke from the fire inside the dwelling, whether it was a teepee or a wigwam, was also a problem. Although smoke vents were provided, improper draft could fill the space with acrid smoke. This made sleeping uncomfortable and made it difficult to breathe, which did not contribute to proper rest. Therefore, the main strategy for nighttime sleep was not to produce new heat, but to conserve as much of the existing heat, the heat of the human body, as possible. Fire was used for cooking, lighting, and as a social center in the evening. But at night it was often extinguished or left with only smoldering coals. The entire survival system was built around this idea, not to rely on an unstable and demanding fire, but to create an ideal insulated environment. This environment had to work passively, using the laws of physics to retain heat. Every element of housing and clothing was part of this ingenious solution. The real source of heat at night was the person themselves, and all the engineering was aimed at ensuring that this heat did not leave them. This is why Native Americans were able to sleep in conditions that seem extreme to us. They did not fight the cold with fire, they insulated themselves from it. This approach required a deep understanding of materials and the principles of thermodynamics. It was honed over millennia of observation and experimentation. The entire culture of sleep was focused on efficiency and energy conservation. People did not waste precious resources on heating the environment. They concentrated on heating their personal space. This fundamental difference in approach is the key to understanding their resistance to cold. What modern materials or technologies do you think could reproduce the same passive heat conservation effect that was achieved with skins and natural materials? Share your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next studies. Want to know a secret that indigenous peoples have always known, but which we often ignore? That secret is the human body itself. At rest, an adult human body emits between 80 and 100 watts of heat, which is comparable to the output of a small incandescent light bulb. The entire strategy for survival in the cold boiled down to a simple task: not letting this heat dissipate in vain. The indigenous peoples of the Great Plains and the forests of the North understood this intuitively. They viewed the body as a furnace that needed not only to be stoked, but also properly insulated. Their fuel was food rich in fats and proteins, which provided the energy needed to maintain internal temperature. On its own, this source of heat seems small, but if retained properly, it can create a comfortable microclimate. The entire system of clothing and bedding was designed as a trap for this heat. They did not heat, but rather retained what had already been produced. This principle is especially important at night, when metabolism slows down and the body produces slightly less heat. Therefore, nighttime insulation had to be even more effective than daytime insulation. It was necessary to create a cocoon in which heat would circulate rather than escape into the cold air or frozen ground. For peoples living in harsh climates, this was not just knowledge, but a way of life. From an early age, children were taught how to move, sit, and sleep properly to minimize heat loss. It was a culture of energy conservation in the truest sense of the word. Sleeping together was one of the most effective methods. Several people sleeping together under one large fur blanket generated significantly more heat. The total surface area through which heat escaped was reduced, and the total heat output increased. In large dwellings, such as the longhouses of the Iroquois, this effect was scaled up. Dozens of people in one enclosed space collectively heated the air. The heat emitted by each person contributed to the overall comfort. It was also important to minimize movement during sleep. Every extra movement disturbed the layer of warm air heated by the body and allowed cold air to enter. Therefore, sleeping areas were organized to ensure maximum rest. Breath control also played a role. People tried not to breathe directly into the sleeping space under the furs, as moisture from their breath could wet the insulation and reduce its effectiveness. Often they kept their heads outside, wrapping their faces with a special scarf or the edge of a fur garment. Thus, the first and most important element of the system was the person themselves. All other technologies, clothing, dwellings, beds, were merely tools to increase the efficiency of this natural heater. But how exactly could these 100 watts of heat be retained using available materials? In the next chapter, we will reveal the secrets of materials that were much more sophisticated than they seem at first glance. I will reveal the most closely guarded secret of survival in the cold, and it has nothing to do with fire, but with fur. We tend to think of fur clothing as primitive, but in fact it was one of the most advanced thermal insulation technologies available to humans. Properly processed fur outperforms many modern synthetic insulators, especially in certain conditions. The secret of fur lies in its multi-layered structure, created by nature itself. It consists of two types of hair: long, stiff guard hair and short, thick, soft undercoat. The guard hair protected against wind and moisture, causing droplets to roll off, while the undercoat created the most important thing, an air layer. It is this trapped air that is the best insulator. Thousands of the finest undercoat fibers created countless tiny air pockets. The heat emitted by the body warmed this air, and the thick fur prevented it from escaping, creating a warm aura around the body. Indigenous peoples were true masters in the processing and use of these materials. They knew which animal skins were best suited for different purposes. For example, bison skins, with their incredibly thick undercoat, were ideal for heavy winter clothing and bedding. Moreover, they understood how the direction of the fur affected its properties. Often, clothing, especially sleeping bags or capes, was sewn with the fur on the inside. The soft undercoat was in direct contact with the body, fitting snugly and capturing the heat emitted as efficiently as possible. The leather side, or flesh side, also underwent special treatment. It was made soft and elastic, but at the same time dense so that it did not let the wind through. It was the equivalent of a modern windproof membrane, working in tandem with insulation. Sleeping accessories were an art form in themselves. Sleeping on the bare ground meant rapid heat loss. Therefore, a layer of insulation, such as spruce branches or dry grass, was first laid on the floor, and thick skins were placed on top of it to serve as a mattress. On top, a person would cover themselves with one or more large skins, often sewn together. This created a multi-layered cocoon. Body heat was trapped between the layers, and the more layers there were, the warmer the sleeping place was. This technology was so effective that a person could sleep on the snow in severe frost without using a fire. The body heat retained by the fur was sufficient to maintain a comfortable temperature inside this cocoon. It was a personal, portable microclimate. It is important to note that caring for such items was critically important. The fur had to remain dry, as wet insulation loses its properties. The skins were regularly aired and dried, but not by fire, but in the wind or light frost. Like this video if you didn't know that fur is such a complex and effective technology and not just a warm skin. What if everything you've been taught about staying warm starts with one simple principle? That principle is layering, and the indigenous peoples of the North and the Plains perfected it long before modern outdoor brands came along. They didn't just put on more clothes, they created an engineered system of multiple functional layers. The first, or base layer, was designed to manage moisture. It was often made of very soft, finely tanned suede or small animal skins. Its job was to wick sweat away from the skin to keep the body dry. The second layer was the main insulator. This could be clothing sewn with fur on the inside, as we mentioned earlier. This layer was voluminous and loose to trap as much air as possible. It created the main insulating layer. The third, or outer, layer served as protection from wind and moisture. It was made of durable, smooth leather clothing, often treated with fat to make it water repellent. It prevented the wind from blowing out the warm air from the insulating layer. Every element of clothing was well thought out. Leggings protected the legs, while parkas or capes made of bison hides covered the torso. It was important that the clothing was loose and did not restrict movement, allowing blood to circulate freely and warm the limbs. Footwear, or moccasins, was also multi-layered. Insoles made of dry grass or fur were inserted inside, which served as both a shock absorber and insulation. In severe cold, an additional layer of leather or fur could be worn over the moccasins. Mittens were preferred to gloves because the fingers, being together, generated more heat. They were also made of fur, creating a warm air chamber for the entire hand. This system allowed for flexible temperature control. If it became hot during physical activity, the top layer could be removed to release steam and prevent sweating. Overheating and subsequent wet clothing were much more dangerous than temporary cold. Thus, a person was not dressed in clothes but in a personal climate control system. It allowed them to stay in the cold for hours, maintaining their performance and comfort. At night, the same clothing could serve as an additional layer of insulation in the sleeping area. People did not go to bed undressed. They only loosened some elements to ensure comfort, but continued to use clothing as part of the overall sleeping system. Which element of this multi-layered system do you think is the most well-designed from an engineering point of view? Clothing was the first line of defense against the cold, but its effectiveness increased many times over inside a properly constructed dwelling. In the next chapter, we will look at how the conical shape of the Tipi on the Great Plains helped to conserve heat. When we look at the tipis of the Great Plains tribes, such as the Lakota or Cheyenne, we see only a conical tent made of animal skins. It seems impossible to stay warm in such a dwelling in winter without a huge fire. However, this structure was much more complex and clever than it appears at first glance, and it was perfectly suited for retaining heat. First, the conical shape was ideal for combating the winds of the plains. It had minimal resistance, and the winds simply flowed around it. This reduced convective heat loss, i.e., the blowing of heat through the walls. Second, the Tipi's covering was made of numerous bison hides sewn together. This material itself had good insulating properties. The hides were tightly fitted and sewn together, creating an almost airtight shell. But the main secret of the tipi, which allowed it to retain heat even without a fire, was the inner lining, or lining. It was a second wall made of skins or fabric, which was attached to the poles from the inside and extended from the ground to a height of 1.5 to 2 meters. This liner created an air gap between the outer wall and the inner living space. This gap worked like double glazing in a modern window. It prevented the cold outside air from coming into direct contact with the warm inside air. Moreover, this insert solved the main problem of any dwelling: drafts. Cold air that could seep in at the base of the teepee entered this gap and did not disturb the people inside. It could not steal heat from those sleeping on the floor. The living space inside the insert was significantly smaller than the total volume of the teepee. This meant that the heat generated by people had to heat a smaller volume of air. This happened much faster and more efficiently. The floor of the teepee was also carefully insulated. It was covered with dry grass and branches, and fur rugs and skins were laid on top. This blocked the cold coming from the frozen ground, which is one of the main sources of heat loss. The entrance to the teepee was closed with a tight flap made of skin, which was also lined with fur. This prevented warm air from escaping outside and cold air from entering inside. In winter, teepees were often set up in wind-protected areas, such as river valleys or among trees. This further reduced wind load and helped to retain heat. Taken together, this system, the aerodynamic shape, double walls, insulated floor, and protected entrance, made the Tipi a surprisingly efficient passive house. The heat from several people sleeping inside accumulated in this enclosed space, maintaining a temperature significantly higher than outside. Are you ready to learn the truth about why a simple dome structure was one of the most efficient? Eastern forest peoples, such as the Iroquois and Algonquians, often built wigwams. This dome-shaped or oblong dwelling was ingenious in terms of heat conservation physics. The main advantage of a dome is maximum internal volume with minimum external surface area. Less surface area means less heat loss to the environment. The heat simply had nowhere to escape as quickly as it would from a square house with corners. The frame of the wigwam was made of flexible young trees that were stuck into the ground, bent, and tied together to form a sturdy lattice structure. This structure was very resistant to wind and snow pressure, which served as additional insulation in winter. Outside, the frame was covered with large sheets of bark, most often birch or elm. Bark is an excellent natural insulator. It is waterproof and has a cellular structure that traps air, slowing down heat transfer. The covering was made in several layers. Often, woven mats made of reeds or grasses were laid on top of the bark. These mats created an additional air gap and protected the bark from damage. The inside of the wigwam was also insulated. The walls could be hung with additional mats or skins. This created another layer of insulation and made the interior more comfortable. As in a teepee, the floor was critically important. It was covered with a thick layer of spruce branches, dry leaves, and grasses. This springy and fragrant mattress prevented the cold from the ground from penetrating inside. The entrance was low and small, and it was always covered with a thick curtain made of skins. This minimized the flow of cold air when entering and exiting. Warm air, heated by the bodies of the inhabitants, rose upward. In the dome structure, it did not accumulate uselessly under the high ceiling, but remained in the living area, circulating and evenly warming the space. In such a dwelling, several people could sleep comfortably using only the heat of their bodies and the thermal insulation properties of the building itself. It was a simple but incredibly elegant engineering solution. Which aspect of the wigwam's design do you think is most important for retaining heat? The shape, the covering materials, or the floor insulation? But what if we take this principle and scale it up for dozens of people? In the next chapter, we will enter the Iroquois longhouse and learn how central heating worked without fire. The peoples of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, whom Europeans called the Iroquois, did not live in small wigwams, but in huge, almost monumental longhouses. These structures were a symbol of their society, both a physical and spiritual embodiment of the idea of unity. Under one roof, not just families, but entire lineages were united. And it was precisely this, collective living in a single space, that became their main secret of warmth. A longhouse was a long rectangular building with an arched roof resembling an elongated tunnel. The frame was constructed from thick posts, usually oak, maple, or elm. Crossbars were tied together with flexible trunks of young trees to form a sturdy dome. The outside was covered with big sheets of elm or cedar bark, taken in the spring when the sap made it flexible and elastic. After drying, it became light but waterproof, reliably protecting the house from rain and snow. Such a structure could reach a length of 30, 40, and sometimes more than 50 meters. Inside, there were up to 20 hearths and dozens of sleeping places. Each hearth belonged to a separate family, but the heat and air were distributed to everyone. The air rose, passed along the vault, and then exited through openings in the roof, creating natural ventilation. Despite this, most of the heat remained at the bottom, where people lived and slept. The main feature of the longhouse was not its architecture, but its social physics. Dozens and sometimes hundreds of people could live in one house. Each of them, even in their sleep, gave off heat, about as much as a small 80-watt lamp. In total, this meant that the entire house was heated by the bodies of its inhabitants. During the cold season, the temperature inside could be 10-15 degrees higher than outside, even without an active fire. The Iroquois intuitively understood the principles of energy efficiency. The more people lived under one roof, the less wall space there was per person. Heat loss was reduced and the indoor climate became more stable. High but gently curved ceilings promoted even air circulation, preventing heat from accumulating in a useless dome. The interior space of the longhouse was carefully organized. On both sides of the passageway were family compartments. Not rooms in the modern sense, but cells with their own hearths and sleeping platforms. These compartments were separated by partitions made of skins or mats, creating small enclosed areas where the temperature was better maintained. Thus, each house was not just a common structure, but a whole system of interconnected microclimates. The sleeping areas in longhouses were designed just as rationally. Along the walls were two-tiered bunks, stretched out like the shelves of a ship. The lower tier was used to store supplies and tools, and the upper tier was for sleeping. This was no accident. Warm air rose and accumulated at the level of the upper tier. People slept where the temperature was 3 to 5 degrees higher than at floor level. The bunks themselves were covered with a thick layer of furs, most often bear deer or bison. Mats made of reeds or birch bark were laid on top of the furs, and light skins were placed on top for cover. At night, the house was dark and quiet, disturbed only by the crackling of the coals. The heat from dozens of bodies enclosed in a closed space kept the air warm until morning. The hearths located along the central line served not only for cooking, but also as heating elements. Above each of them, a hole was made in the roof for smoke to escape, which could be regulated by covering it with bark or mats depending on the wind. When the hearth was extinguished, the residual heat from the stones and coals continued to radiate, maintaining a comfortable temperature. But it wasn't just the air that was warm. The main source of heat was life itself. In winter, the longhouse turned into a small world. Work was in full swing, baskets were woven, clothes were sewn, stories were told. All of this, breathing, movement, communication, released energy. Unlike a lonely hut on the plain, the longhouse never froze completely because it was filled with collective activity. This is where the genius of the Haudenosaunee manifested itself, in the combination of architecture and social organization. They understood that survival was not only about engineering, but also about community. By joining forces, people created not just housing, but a climatic system in which every family, every person, was an element of a single mechanism for preserving heat. Even when the fire in the hearth died down, the house remained warm, a living, human warmth. This warmth did not come from wood or coal, but from presence. Thus, the longhouse became not just a building, but a metaphor, the warm body of a people, inside which life continued despite the cold outside the walls. In the far north, in the subarctic regions where the Cree, Athabascan, and other peoples lived, winter was not just a time of cold. It was a dominant force around which all life was built. Here, temperatures could drop to -40, winds from the plains turned the air into knives, and trees creaked from the frost. But it was here that people learned to use what seemed to be an enemy as an ally. Snow, ice, and cold became not only obstacles, but also materials, tools, and protection. Many people mistakenly believe that snow is the embodiment of cold, but the peoples of the north knew that snow is warmth, only in a different form. Freshly fallen loose snow consists of more than 90% air, trapped in a complex crystalline lattice of ice. Air is the best natural insulator. That is why the ground does not freeze through to the end of winter under a blanket of snow. And animals such as lemmings and partridges hibernate under the snow, where the temperature stays around zero even in 40-degree frost. People observed nature and drew conclusions. If snow protects animals, it can also protect humans. One of the simplest and most ingenious solutions was the snow-covered wigwam. The base was a frame of flexible poles covered with bark, branches, or matting. Outside, it was covered with a thick layer of snow. The snow was laid down gradually in layers and compacted by hand or shovel until it formed a dense dome. This layer turned the wigwam into a real thermal system. The wind did not penetrate inside, sounds were muffled, and the heat from the hearth or the bodies of the inhabitants remained under the snow cover. Even without a fire inside such a dwelling, the temperature at ground level could be 20 degrees higher than outside. The secret was that the snow insulated not only from the wind, but also from radiative cooling. It reflected the heat back inside. As a result, the space between the inner wall and the snow shell turned into a heat trap. The simplest shelter could be made in literally an hour. If a person got caught in a blizzard, it was enough to find a deep snowdrift, dig a hole in it down to the ground, and lay spruce branches on the bottom. Skins or branches were laid on top to form a roof. Such a snow burrow could save a life. The temperature inside remained stable, and the wind had no chance of getting through. Even in such an improvised pit, a person could spend the night without frostbiting their face and hands. More experienced hunters built more complex temporary snow shelters. They did not build them out of blocks like the Inuit, but used the snow itself as a mass. First, they raked up a large pile of snow, sometimes as tall as a person. Then they left the snow for a while to mature. The fresh snow had to settle and stick together a little. After that, they dug out a chamber from the inside with a knife or a bone spatula. The inner surface of the walls gradually warmed up from their breath and bodies, melted slightly, and froze again, turning into a smooth, durable ice crust. This thin crust, barely noticeable, a couple of millimeters thick, worked wonders. It turned loose snow into a monolith that reflected heat and was completely airtight. Inside such a shelter, the air warmed up quickly. One person's breath could raise the temperature to 0 or even higher. Outside, however, the frost continued to rage at -30 or -40 degrees. Special attention was paid to the entrance. It was never made straight. The entrance was designed as a low tunnel leading up to the main chamber. This design created a cold trap effect. Heavy cold air sank down the tunnel without rising back up. As a result, a relatively warm layer of air was retained inside, which was not blown out with every movement. Sometimes the entrance was additionally covered with skins or pine branches, making it almost airtight. The floor in a snow house was no less important than the walls. It was raised, making a floor covering of spruce branches, dry grass, or reeds. This insulated people from the snow, preventing heat loss through conduction. Deer, caribou, or moose skins were laid on top of the flooring. Combined with fur clothing, this created a system capable of maintaining comfort even in the harshest conditions. Such snow and earth shelters were temporary, but their effectiveness was astonishing. They were built from what nature provided: snow, branches, skins, air. No fuel, no tools except a knife and their own hands. But inside, people could survive, warm up, rest, and even sleep peacefully. This architecture of survival was the result of thousands of years of observation. The Cree and Athabascan peoples did not fight the snow. They made it part of their world. They knew that there are no enemies in nature, only forces that must be understood and used. Snow, cold, and darkness were not threats, but materials that, with the right approach, provided warmth, peace, and life. We have talked a lot about dwellings and clothing, but the central element of a warm sleep without fire was the bed itself. It was here in the silence of the winter night that the main battle for heat preservation took place. Everything that a person did during the day, gathering firewood, repairing their dwelling, sewing clothes, had meaning only for this purpose: to survive the night. Sleep was not rest, but a test of the effectiveness of all measures. Indigenous peoples and early settlers knew very well that the main enemy of sleep was not the icy air above their heads, but the cold ground beneath their bodies. Even inside a warm dwelling, the ground remained a huge accumulator of cold. It slowly but surely drew heat from the body. Therefore, the first rule of survival was simple: never sleep on the ground. Even inside a tipi, wigwam, or hut, sleeping on the floor was considered madness. The first layer was always a barrier. Springy insulation was laid on the floor, a thick layer of spruce or pine branches. This material was ideal. The needles created a springy, air-filled cushion that lifted the sleeper above the cold surface. The air between the branches acted as a natural heat insulator. In addition, the branches exuded the scent of resin, which repelled insects and gave the dwelling a special, fresh smell. In other regions where there were no coniferous trees, dry grass, reeds, or bundles of willow twigs were used. Sometimes whole mats were woven from reeds or rushes, which could be rolled up and carried from place to place. In nomadic life, this was of great importance. Regardless of the region, the goal remained the same: to create an air layer between the body and the ground so that the heat emanating from the person would not escape downward. On top of this base was laid a second layer, a kind of mattress. This was made of thick skins, bison, elk, or bear. They were laid with the fur facing up so that the wool would trap air and create a soft, warm surface. You could sleep directly on these skins, without blankets, and even in severe frost, your body would stay warm. Sometimes, for extra comfort, a woven blanket made of grass fibers or wool was placed on top. But the most interesting part came next, in the design of the sleeping area itself. Unlike the modern concept of a bed, it was a whole system. People rarely just covered themselves from above. They created an enclosed space, a warm cocoon. A person would lie down on one skin and cover themselves with another, sealing themselves in something like a fur envelope. Many cultures had something similar to a modern sleeping bag. Two large skins were sewn together at the edges with the fur inside. A person would climb completely into the resulting bag, sometimes leaving only their face exposed. After spending a few minutes inside, the air would warm up and create its own microenvironment, warm, dry, and protected from the wind. Such fur bags were a masterpiece of practical thinking. They did not require fuel, did not depend on fire, and were not blown through by drafts. Their effectiveness was amazing. Even at minus 20 degrees, a comfortable temperature was maintained inside. Northern tribes even had double bags. One was placed inside the other to add a layer of insulation in severe frosts. The warmth of the human body, enclosed in such a space, was the best heater. Therefore, it is not surprising that on cold nights people often slept together. Entire families would lie under one large blanket or in a common bag. This was not a sign of cramped living conditions. It was a survival strategy. The warmth of several bodies combined to create a stable temperature. This was especially important for children. They were placed between adults to protect them from hypothermia. In houses with wooden or earthen floors, raised sleeping platforms were used. The Iroquois, for example, had platforms about half a meter high along the walls of their longhouses. This solution had several advantages. First, cold air, being heavier, accumulated at the bottom, which meant that it was warmer above. Second, the platforms remained dry even when snow melted or humidity was high. And finally, things could be stored under them, thus saving space. Caring for the bed was no less important than caring for clothing. Fur bedding could not be wet. Damp fur quickly lost its properties and began to rot. Therefore, in good weather, the skins were taken outside to dry. In the sun and frost, the fur came to life. Moisture came out of it. It became fluffier and cleaner, and low temperatures killed parasites and bacteria. It was a natural hygiene cycle known long before microbiology. In some places, especially in the Arctic regions, nomads placed a thin layer of sand or ash under their sleeping skins. It served as dry drainage, preventing moisture from accumulating under the bed. In more settled cultures, the floor in the sleeping area was covered with additional flooring made of boards, reeds, or even whale bones, anything that could insulate from the ground. The bed was not just a place to rest. It was the heart of nighttime survival, a small, autonomous home within a large one. The entire logic of winter life was built around it. The dwelling protected from the wind, clothing retained body heat, but it was the bed that kept life going. It can be said that in these fur nests, on beds of pine needles and grass, the idea of a sleeping bag, thermal insulation, and even the principle of a microclimate was born when a person creates their own world of warmth within the hostile cold. The last but perhaps most important element of the survival system is not technology, but knowledge. No insulation, no stove, no clothing would have saved a person if they were in the wrong place. It was understanding the landscape, its character, wind directions, snow and water behavior, that determined whether winter would be a test or a death sentence. This knowledge was not recorded in books. It was passed down by word of mouth from generation to generation as a sacred science about where one could live and where the land would kill. Choosing the right place for a winter camp, a village, or even a single night's stay could be more important than the thickness of the fur bedding or the quality of the wigwam. One wrong decision, and a person risked spending the night in a place where the wind blew the heat out of the fire, where the snow did not melt even under the fire, where the cold stood like a wall. The indigenous peoples of North America, who had lived in this climate for centuries, knew these patterns thoroughly. They did not just inhabit the land, they were in dialogue with it. The first and most important rule was to never set up camp in an open area. On the plains where the wind met no obstacles, open spaces became real traps. Cold air moved across the ground like a stream of water, carrying snow dust and freezing everything in its path. In such places, it was impossible to stay warm, even with a well-built fire. Therefore, Native Americans, trappers, and early settlers always sought natural shelters provided by nature itself. The best winter camps were located in river valleys, protected from the north and west by high banks or hills. These elevations served as a shield from the prevailing winds. On the south side, there was open space where the sun could shine, even if it was low in the winter sky. This combination of protection and light created a unique microclimate. Even in the severe frosts, it was possible to stay warm without wasting fuel. The dense forest was another natural ally, especially coniferous forests, spruce and pine. Their thick branches not only blocked the wind, but also retained snow, creating a dome above the ground. Under this green canopy, the temperature could be several degrees higher than in the open. In addition, dry branches, resin, and pine needles for bedding could always be found in coniferous forests. Even the snow there was different. Loose, light, and not frozen into an icy crust. The orientation of the camp relative to the cardinal points was no less important. People set up their dwellings so that the entrance or main wall faced south or southeast. This allowed them to use the sun's energy, albeit weak, as efficiently as possible. When the first rays of the sun rose above the horizon, they immediately hit the camp, warming the air, tents, and bodies. It was a natural analog of the passive heating used in architecture today. But despite their love of the sun, experienced hunters and nomads avoided lowlands. Instinct told them that it was warmer at the bottom of the valley than at the top. However, physics was relentless. Cold air is heavier than warm air, and therefore it flowed downwards, accumulating in hollows and basins. Real lakes of cold formed there. The temperature difference between the bottom of the valley and its slopes could reach 10 degrees. In such places, the hearth smoked, the fire burned poorly, and the night turned into an icy torment. Proximity to water had a dual significance. On the one hand, water was a source of life. It was needed for drinking, cooking, and fishing. But on the other hand, it carried danger. The air is always more humid near open bodies of water, and humidity makes the cold more penetrating. Fog and frost accumulated on clothing, turning fur into icy armor. Therefore, people chose places near water, but no closer than an arrow's flight. Close enough to walk to, but not so close as to feel the breath of the river. Every detail mattered. Even the direction of the entrance to a wigwam or tipi was carefully thought out. The entrance was never left facing north, where the cold wind came from. If the terrain allowed, it was covered with natural obstacles, bushes, trees, or even a large snowdrift that was specially raked to form a shield. Sometimes a small snow wall was built behind the dwelling, the simplest but most effective form of thermal insulation. Today, this knowledge is called reading the landscape. It is not just observation. It is the ability to understand the language of the earth. People knew how to read the traces of the wind by the shape of snowdrifts, determine the direction of air currents by the movement of smoke from a fire, and see from the structure of the snow where it would be warm and where it would be cold. They used the landscape not as a backdrop, but as part of the architecture, incorporating it into their protection system. This knowledge did not require tools. It required eyes, ears, and memory. Experience was passed on not in words, but in deeds, from father to son, from mother to daughter, from the mouths of elders to those who were just learning to understand the land. A person might not be able to read letters, but he could read the snow, wind, and sun better than any scientist. Thus, the system of survival on the frontier was not a set of isolated techniques, but a living, holistic structure. It began long before construction, with the choice of the right location. Then came the dwelling itself, simple but well thought out, capable of retaining heat. After that came clothing, layers of wool and fur that turned a person into a walking thermos. And finally, the warm cocoon of sleep, the last line of defense, where body heat became the main source of life. Survival was not a struggle against nature, but cooperation with it. People knew that if they chose the right place, the wind would become their ally, the sun their heater, and the earth itself their home. We see that the survival of the indigenous peoples of North America in harsh winter conditions was based not on fighting nature with fire, but on deep harmony with it. They used the laws of physics and natural materials with remarkable efficiency. The warmth of the human body, the ingenious engineering of furs, the layering of clothing, and the thoughtful architecture of dwellings all came together to form a unified system. This system of passive heat conservation was reliable, sustainable, and did not require the constant expenditure of enormous resources. Tipis, wigwams, and longhouses were not just shelters, but complex machines for living, honed by millennia of experience. They prove that a deep understanding of the world around us can be more powerful than any technology. The legacy of this ingenuity is not just a historical fact, but a reminder that solutions often lie in understanding principles rather than brute force. People slept warm without fire because they had mastered the art of insulation. What other aspects of the daily life or technology of the indigenous peoples of North America would you like to see in our future videos? Perhaps you are interested in navigation methods, food preservation techniques, or their social structures. Suggest your topics in the comments and don't forget to subscribe to our channel.